Right, hello. I've poured myself a beer. Get yourself a nice drink too. The purpose of this video is to have a look at tackling something like modelling a hallway. What you're seeing at the moment is that I took this reference from the film Alien, and I'm going to try and model a similar kind of hallway to this. So I'm going to use this as like the jumping off point as inspiration. So here I am just cutting out one section of the hallway because I'm going to duplicate the hallway later. First things first, I load in my human scale reference, and then also I load in that image, just like I showed you actually last week. And again, like I also mentioned last week, I'm going to start off with a plane. I'm shifting the pivot point to one edge, and then I'm moving it so that the center line kind of runs down the middle of the z-axis, so it's symmetrized on either side of the x-axis. What I did here, actually, what you're seeing here, is that I then duplicated the plane, but I used duplicate special, and I duplicated it as an instance. What an instance is, it's initially it looks exactly like a normal duplicate, but what an instance is it kind of remembers what it was duplicated from. So anything that you do to the original will be copied in the instance, and it can be a really useful way of just modeling one side of something and seeing that sort of mirrored on the other side. Again, I've repositioned the pivot point now, so everything lies kind of fairly flat on the origin of the Maya kind of grid, and I'm remembering to save my file, which is super important. In a moment, I'll probably oh yeah, here we go. I'm separating out now. So once I've got the dimensions of the corridor how I want them to be, so I'm going to select the main segments like the wall, the floor, the ceiling, the kind of curb-like part of it, and I'm extracting them using extract polygon, so I can deal with those bits differently. And I'm constantly flicking back to the original reference and also looking at my reference in the viewport. So now I'm working on the curb kind of bit, because there's, as you can see, there's a sort of little bit that kind of comes up like one part of the column or sort of support or something like that. Again, I'm just extruding edges to begin to make this. If you extrude edges, you're just, as I mentioned last week, you're less likely to get leftover faces than if you select faces and start extruding them like crazy. So here I am, just sort of figuring out roughly what it should look like. Every now and again, what I'll do, if I see when I pull up these faces here, these edges, what you can't see is, because obviously this video is speeded up about 4 times actual speed, is that I will hit merge vertices every now and again when I pull up one edge, and so it aligns itself with another edge. But of course, if you would hit smooth, you know, those edges aren't actually connected or anything kind of like that. So it's important to remember to hit that merge vertices button once in a while. So here you go, blocking out. I think, as you notice, I'm not putting in any bevels or anything like that at the moment. All I'm worried about at the moment is figuring out the rough kind of form. Right, yeah, I think this next bit is the beginnings of the this kind of column kind of separate apart that angles upwards, and this bit is causing me, well, it ends up causing me a fair bit of headache in terms of how to best efficiently kind of model it. You won't notice it for a bit yet, because I get it to a certain point and then I realise that I really need to go in and clean it up. It's also a little bit difficult to tell from the reference imagery exactly the kind of shape that it kind of makes, but I'm not too fussed about 100% recreating this corridor from Alien. I'm just using it really for inspiration. I tend to use the bridge tool a lot, just to sort of quickly connect up two edges to make a face. And then a lot of the multi-cut to add those extra edge loops where I need them to be. I'm always trying to snap kind of vertices to either the grid or to other parts of either the same object or other objects, just to try and make things as neat as possible, which is what you should always be striving to do. Yeah, I make a lot of mistakes on this subject, but that's part of it. You just got to get used to it. Constantly look at your object and figure out, where's it wrong? How do I need to fix it? When objects are simple kind of boxes or box-like objects, then it's not so bad. But when you get something just even a little bit more complicated, it can require a bit of a think. So the purpose of this is I'm generating this hallway for Monday and Friday's Intro to CGI session as a kind of as a base to play around with some lighting, because I'm going to be talking about lighting on Monday and Friday when it comes to CGI. But then I thought it would be useful just to show the process of how I go about modelling it. I'm not claiming to be some kind of elite modeler in the slightest. There are people who do modeling and that's all they do, and they look at my kind of workflow and they go, "Oh, you're making so many kind of rookie errors and things like that." But I have worked for 21, 22 years, sort of having to be able to do this kind of stuff when needed, if and when required. So I think it's important as a complete sort of newbie who maybe is a bit intimidated by where do you even start. I think it's useful to see a sort of fairly logical standard way of approaching these kind of things, which I just mentioned obviously loads and loads of times in the lecture, but it's start as simple as you possibly can and don't start adding all those edge loops and bevels and stuff like that. Oh, there you go. I realised I'd created some extra faces that I didn't need, so I went in and deleted those. Always be on the lookout for faces that are left over from extrusions that are either going to cause you problems later in terms of adding edge loops, or they're just waste of space when you come to UVing. So I always try and tumble around the object looking for it. Not much going on here. This is probably me either going to the toilet or going downstairs and beginning to cook food. I should have edited this bit out. Maybe I should do the ASMR thing. Like this, the ASMR lecturer of CGI. Because I am using my binaural mic. Oh, I'm back to modelling again. Good. I think one of the temptations that you have when you do this kind of thing is impatience, not realizing how long it's going to take to build something, and the motivation begins to run low when you get to the 30-40 minute mark and it still doesn't seem like you've got much to show for it, and you're desperate, and also what you've got to show for it is very crude geometry and models that don't really look very exciting. They don't look very cool or useful at the moment. So managing to get past that sort of block of running out of patience. Because I think the problem is when you run out of patience, you are likely to start trying to make your objects look prettier straight away by adding all those bevels and loops. I'm just as guilty of it, or being tempted by it. This is me trying to figure out whether I can use the grease pencil, by the way, to sort of annotate stuff. I haven't used a grease pencil before. It's a way of just scribbling notes over your Maya scene. I couldn't figure it out, and I thought I'm not going to waste time figuring it out, so I abandoned that. But as I was saying, you run out of patience and you want everything to look nicer, and so the inclination is to start beveling and putting edge loops in, and start noodling away at details that just aren't needed. If you can get past that sort of that impatience, and you can just keep on working on it, knowing that the boring stuff now is going to pay off later, then you can have a nicer time eventually. Also, obviously knowing that strange noise, by the way, I'm just going to... My daughter's got some kind of strange toy or something like that. So hang on a second. Okay, back. I don't know what's happened. What's happened? Yeah, I'm continuing to make more of a mess of this kind of supporting sort of column structure that holds these pipes into place. I will at one point in this video go back and completely kind of trash most of the faces in this and sort of rebuild it so it makes a lot more sense. It's a lot more, well, neater. It's got too many edges. I was trying to be too fancy for my own good. I'm thinking, oh, should I just fill up this hole? Yeah, I'll fill up the hole. Do I actually really need that as a hole? And remember, you know, I'm at the beginning of this, I cut out just 1/2 of the corridor, because even though this corridor in actuality isn't completely symmetrical, it's symmetrical enough that if I just model 1/2 of the corridor, I can flip the whole thing. And then it will just sort of almost... I'm not gonna say it's gonna look awesome. I'm not claiming that this model looks particularly awesome by the time I finish with it, but it's gonna look a lot better because it's gonna look way more complicated than it actually is. Because really, I just started modeling 1/2 of it, and with the knowledge that I could go back. Well, at the end of this, of the procedure, I can duplicate it, sort of flip it, mirror it. To make one whole section of the corridor, and then I can then duplicate the whole thing, and it's suddenly going to look like a relatively complicated corridor. I'm not going to texture this at all, but I want you to imagine that you know, it looks fairly complicated when it's finished, but just because of the repetition of detail. But then you combine what you might do in Substance Painter to use those kind of normal maps, as they call them, which are ways of faking extra detail. And sort of, if you're unfamiliar with normal maps give the impression that there's more detail in an object than there actually is, but it's kind of a trick. It's a texture map. Most of you, I think, should know roughly what normal maps are by now, but if you don't, that's kind of what they are. They look like these kind of crazy bluey purpley kind of textures that tell Arnold, or even computer games. They were initially kind of designed more for video games. I think Doom 3 was one of the ones that really began to show off normal maps, and Doom 3 is full of science fiction-y corridors that owe a lot to the original Alien film, and also Aliens. Always trying to look for those faces that won't be needed and deleting them. and then duplicating, scaling by -1 in either X or Z to kind of mirror it, and then combining the objects and then merging the vertices. It's like just a repeated pattern that happens a lot. Adding a little bit this kind of strange panel thing onto one of the sides of the columns here by doing insert multiple edge loops and then beveling those edges to kind of give me the sort of little panels like that. And that's about as far as I'm going to model that. I don't need to model that anymore. So again, I'm chopping off bits of the original model so that I know that I can then add loops and bevels and stuff without screwing up what I've already done, and that it will all still fit together. I think I probably say that every single session when I talk to people, but I don't think it can hurt. I'd rather be boring and get the message across. So as I said, this is speeded up about 4 times. So by the end of it, the whole thing is gonna, well, would have taken me just over 4 hours, I think. Probably a little bit less because there's some dead points when I've had to go downstairs, as you noticed. You have to resign yourself to the fact that it will take you a bit of time to do this. Don't expect this to go super quick. The quality of the model or the CG scene is completely dependent on the time and the effort that you put into it. When you're a super elite modeler with years and years and years and years of experience, you'll probably be able to do this much quicker. And I would expect you in some ways to spend more time on this anyway. I kind of gave myself a self-imposed deadline of 4 hours to do the whole thing, because I also knew that I had to record this to sort of talk through it, and also make sure everything is prepared for the digital matte painting lecture or lectures, and that the digital photography for VFX is all done as well. So I literally could not spend too much time on this and also have a nice weekend. Although I'm enough of a nerd that I actually do enjoy modelling stuff in CG, especially if it's of the second best science fiction film of all time. Jamie asked what the best science fiction film was of all time when I mentioned that last Thursday, and that is 2001: A Space Odyssey. And I'll debate people who disagree with that. Okay, so here I am, almost making this cardinal sin of not following my own advice, and I just can't help it. I want to bevel. I want to see what it looks like. And an object like this that has sort of an indentation provides little beveling challenges. What edges do you bevel to make it so you end up with a neat mesh? I'm not going to necessarily smooth everything in this model. You don't need to smooth everything. Having said that, I am modeling this with a view to smooth it. So this kind of shape provides little challenges with what edges do you bevel and how do you bevel them. Here's a rough bit of advice. Whenever you bevel stuff, it's normally a good idea to bevel by 2 segments. If you're going to be smoothing things later, if you bevel by 2 segments, and you bevel the right edges, you're going to probably still end up with 4-sided polygons, which, as I've mentioned, is the sort of goal. Now, you can get away with the occasional 5-sided polygon, and you can get away with the occasional triangle. But if you can, try and only model and end up with 4 sides to each polygon, because smoothing is just going to be a lot more predictable. And a shape like that one at the moment, just then, that with the sort of indentation. There's a bit of a challenge because it's which edges do you bevel. I would maybe pause the video to see which edges I ended up beveling. Essentially, all the hard edges and all the diagonals that connect to the hard edges. It almost becomes the point where I'm beveling all the edges, which is a little bit inefficient. But I think sometimes you can, I'm always giving you this advice like be neat, don't have too many edges, don't have too many faces, etc. And I think sometimes that you can become too fanatical with that. And sometimes when you need to bevel and add edge loops to get a predictable, clean result when you smooth, sometimes you do need that extra geometry. This is something that comes up a lot on the Polycount forum post, how the beep do I model this, which I really urge you to have a look at. I mentioned to the people on Friday as well to look at Pinterest of all places. Look at Pinterest and type polygons, topology, edge loops, etc. And you'll find a lot of very, very useful, beautiful little produced images with little guides on how to manage your edges. I'm amazed when I saw that on Pinterest, but it's super, super useful. But on the polycount.com forum, oh yeah, this is where I've decided to completely trash all of that geometry. It's looking too janky. I had to remake it and make it a lot better, which thankfully I do. But that, that website, polycount.com, and their forum, how the beep do I model this, is extremely useful because people have trouble modeling what they call hard surface models, which is what we're doing here, and how to arrange their loops and their edges and points. And you can literally just write your problem of how, I don't know, how do I model this? So this is what I've modeled so far, but it looks terrible. And when it smooths, it looks awful, even worse. Help. And the people on there, they are just like, they're the CGI saints. They'll often actually do it for you. Or if not literally do it for you on your scene file, they will recreate it and then give you a beautiful little diagram detailing where you went wrong. So look at that. It's just, it's extremely useful. And yeah, as I mentioned, Pinterest as well. Okay, we're getting a lot cleaner mesh here. Makes a lot more sense now, rather than me trying to be a little bit too clever for my own good earlier on. Spent a lot of time on this. But, it's got to look right. You got to do what you got to do. So doing this so that I can then delete a whole bunch of faces that are pointless by creating that diagonal cut, just lining everything up so it looks good, flattening all my vertices out so they're on the same plane, selecting them all and then just scaling them in one axis, the axis that I want to be flat on, and yeah, just chopping those away. Don't need those, get rid of them. What I'm doing here, I'm turning, this is quite important. You see what I did there? You want to minimize the amount of edges when you turn corners. That kind of, it's not quite a right angle, but the diagonal comes up and then it turns around. And previously I had two edges to describe that turn, but it's better to have one edge or one diagonal edge so that you have at least two less polygons, and also it means that the edge flows around the corner, which means that you can bevel stuff a lot better, a lot more predictably. That is quite an important thing, learning how to do that. So you're looking for not right angle edges when some piece of geometry sort of turns at 90 degrees or close to 90 degrees. Instead, you'll end up more with what looks like a sort of 45-degree angle. Two less edges, leaving you with one edge that sort of turns at 45 degrees. So I thought I'd go in now and model just a little bit of, just to give me a bit of a mind break from what was going on earlier. I wanted to model in just a little bit of detail just because, again, I'm only human. I get bored modeling stuff that looks too plain. So I want to model in something that I can repeat and use quite a lot in the whole process. A sort of a port for a kind of pipe that's going to happen later. And I figure I can reuse this a lot through the model. So I'm starting, like I start with things like, not a fidget spinner, but with that sort of ring that I showed that has holes in it. I think using a pipe is actually a really good little primitive to use, because it gives you these flat faces that you can delete all the faces except the ones you need. You can model out some detail, and then you know that if you duplicate special and rotate, you can get cool little complicated looking models. So I'm finding the right edge loops to add here to give me that kind of segment, that piece that I want. Now I duplicate special and I get it wrong the first time. Too many duplicates. Oh, wrong. Where did I go wrong? Oh yeah, I deleted all but, I didn't delete all but one segment, I deleted all but two segments. So I actually need to half the amount of duplicates and double the rotational value. But now I get myself this little sort of little port thing. I'm going to use the circularize tool here to sort of make that look a little bit more, I don't know, looks nicer. Now you could go in here, and I briefly toy with the idea of going in and neatening this up. But then I abandon it because I figure by the amount of time it would take me to neaten up and minimize edges and get edges flowing from, say, 5 edges down into 3, I'll spend so much time there that I'll completely bust my 4-hour time limit. So I'm going to put that there. Right, this also goes, this is less of a CG thing now. Oh yeah, I'm putting a light in. I'm coming up to my first break, where I'm actually going to have a proper break, and I thought I'm just going to stick a light in because I just want to see what it looks like. I'm going to stick a neon type light in just here. Or just there. I'll up the exposure a bit on that. And I think, oh yeah, it's looking promising. I think this is going to look okay when it's duplicated. So I save it, and here I'm back. In the blink of an eye, I've gone downstairs, cooked penne arrabbiata for my wife, and a pizza for my daughter and myself. But you wouldn't know it. The magic of editing. Okay, so now I'm using bonus tools in Maya. Now the Friday group probably know about this because I think Paul has gone through bonus tools. I have not gone through bonus tools with my normal Monday group, but I will do on Monday, tomorrow. Bonus tools are a bunch of little extra add-on stuff for Maya that should, I'm having to watch my language here, that really should be part of Maya by default, because they're such basic things you need to do. Unfortunately, they're not. And this bonus tool I'm using here is Create Tube. Create Tube is a godsend. I mean, you'll be making lots of tubes and pipes in your CG career if you're a concept artist for sure. And what Create Tube does is it lets you draw out a curve to describe where you want your tube to go, and then just with one menu command, turn that curve into a pipe or a tube. You can also turn it into a ribbon, which is just like a flat kind of shape. If you don't use bonus tools, then you can still totally do this, but it is such a faff. You have to create one NURBS curve where you want your sort of pipe or your tube to go. You have to make another NURBS circle to describe the kind of shape, the profile shape. Then you have to select them both, and you have to extrude one along the other. And the default settings are always completely wrong, and there are lots and lots of settings to then fiddle with. And oh god, it takes so long. So that bonus tool is a lovely little one-click solution. You just draw the curve where you want your pipe to be, go Create Tube, and it'll turn that that curve into a little tube. I will show the Monday group tomorrow, and I'll remind the Friday group on Friday. It's going to be, yeah, so pipes are important. Okay, modeling in just another little sort of terminating point for a pipe here. again, sort of breaks up some of the shape. This is, I'm going to maybe talk a little bit about concept art. I've talked with the concept artists about this idea of big, medium and small shapes, and how important it is to create something that feels pleasing to the eye, just aesthetically pleasing. And I think despite the alien hallways and corridors being pretty detailed and dense, they still adhere to this, still have lovely production design, and adhere to this idea that there will be areas of the hallway that don't have much detail or have non-distracting kind of detail, and then there'll be medium kind of blocks of detail, these kind of control panels that are built occasionally on the sides of the walls, and then there'll be these kind of clustered bits of hyper detail, like the pipes and little bits of detail that go on those kind of control panel type things. So I'm thinking about this as I'm modeling it, because I'm not one-to-one modeling this this alien corridor, although I'm heavily inspired by it. So I'm beginning to rough out now the kind of console panel type things that go on the side of the corridors. This is actually probably the most complicated part of the whole model, and I do attempt to model, I get the proportions wrong on this, but I think I do a decent stab at actually adding this kind of, when it comes up on screen I'll point it out, or I can't really point it out. There, you see this little handrail. You'll know it when I come up to it, to be honest. There were these kind of bits that go onto the side that have like two sort of holes that go through it, but they're kind of machined rectangular kind of holes that slope around the angles. I think this is probably a pretty useful thing to watch, actually, and did cause me a little bit of a headache. So again, just blocking out the rough form and profile. And once I get to the point where I'm sort of happy with that, I figure it needs that sort of gentle curve going around it, so I use a bevel to get that shape, and then I extrude that bit in, and I'm going to use that as a basis to build the slightly more complicated part. That sort of, I don't know, it's not like a handle, it's got some holes in it. You'll see when I model this, but it is I found it quite tricky, because it's also got this thing, this distinctive signature of Alien's production design, which is very machined and sort of industrial, but with these strange kind of soft, curvy, padded kind of elements to it. I find it vaguely sinister. I don't know why. Is it trypophobia thing that I've got going on? Hopefully you can see the bit now that I'm going to be attempting to model. I'll concentrate on it exclusively. Yeah, here we go. So I'm trying to build up this shape. So I've got because I'm building this from an extracted extrusion from the overall rough base shape, I know that these holes will kind of work. I'll give it a bit of thickness, and then this is where I begin to run into the headache of how to make this work. So I'm extruding the whole object, giving it subdivision of 1, and then reversing going to mesh display reverse, because it was inside out. I know a bunch of people every now and then come to that. Okay, here I'm snapping. Get used to this. If you do extract something out and it doesn't quite work, or it doesn't match up, you want to use those snap vertices to other vertices. Temporarily hold down V, and then move your vert around until it snaps to the vertex that you want it to be exactly aligned to. God, Alien is such a good film. I love Alien. I reckon I saw Alien when I was too young. It came out in 1979. I think it was first on television like 1980, 1981 or something. I didn't watch it then, because I would have only been 4 or 5, which would have been way too young to watch it. But I reckon I saw a little bit of the beginning of it or something. Like I might have crept downstairs and just peeked around the living room door while my parents were watching it or something. Because then when I eventually did watch it properly for the first time, the look of it and the sound of it as well, the soundtrack and the sound effects of it, had such a crazy sense of deja vu. I love it. Absolutely love Alien. I love Aliens as well. I think that's an example, not necessarily of a sequel that's better than the original, but a sequel that definitely stands up and is very dear to my heart. And so influential in terms of visual design, just as much as Star Wars. So it kind of took that sort of used, dirty future aesthetic and took it away from the fantasy and more into something that felt, well, I suppose more science fiction as opposed to science fantasy, which I guess Star Wars is a bit. Okay, so you can see how this object then is beginning to look. It's getting there. I need to figure out the right edges to... I don't use any kind of creasing in this. I use just pure that beveling and edge loop workflow. But I get there after I make a few mistakes. And there we go, I'm getting there now. But my topology is a bit messed up when I realise that I need to give it some depth to the other side. But again, I just want you to all realise that sometimes it is going to be a headache and you are going to have to toil away for a few hours on something that's a bit tricky. But the end result is more than worth it. I think it's an amazing thing to do, to be able to visualize something that's just 2D, either a 2D bit of artwork that you've created, or a 2D artwork that someone else has created, or a photograph that you found, or a film that you really like, and to make that into 3 dimensions and have the ability then to make it how you want it to be and light it the way that you want to light it. I don't know, it's very empowering, I think. Okay, yes, I'm figuring out here how to do the interior bits. So initially, if I remember correctly, because I did this last night, initially I'm trying to snap and draw a new polygon to fit this. Can't remember whether I settle for this method, or whether instead, or whether I start with that method. Well, we'll see. I know at one point, and the problem is when you start to sort of get exactly the same shape, if you extrude it, because it's got little tight bevels there and edge loops, they'll start crisscrossing over themselves. Here we go. You probably notice this. There we go. Can you see how that's happening? Creating odd, funky little shapes there that are no good. So I figure, well, okay, I'll go in and I'll just merge those. I'll end up with some triangles, but who cares? We're not working in computer games here. As long as it hasn't got the dreaded face on top of face, which I think I do have at one point when I have to delete it, I don't mind. Controversial statement. Alien, Blade Runner, both directed by Ridley Scott. In fact, he did Blade Runner after he did Alien. Both feature androids, or, well, one features an android, one features a replicant, but the androids in Alien are very similar to replicants. I think Alien is a superior film about androids and artificial intelligence than Blade Runner is. Because you get everything with Alien. You get a film about AI. You know, Ash, the android. He's not completely cold. You know, he has emotions. He's an android, but he has his own opinions and he's autonomous. You know, he's not like Hal from 2001, who's caught in a horrible logical loop and can't act. Hal is menacing, but he's coming at it from his own point of view. And also you get an amazing film about an unknown alien terror. I don't know why I'm switching into the David Bowie voice here, but yeah, I have opinions about Ridley Scott. It's heartbreaking because he's both responsible for one of my favourite ever films, Alien, and also one of the trashiest films ever, Alien Covenant. I mean, they're even in the same franchise. Don't get me started on Ridley Scott. Yeah, so I'm spending a fair bit of time on this. But, you know, it's such a key feature of this corridor. Without it, the corridor would be just a little bit too plain. So I figure I've got to make it look reasonably decent. I wonder who's still watching at this point. I want you to sort of realise that, I mean, you do not have to know every single bit of Maya, right? I do not know every single little last bit of Maya at all. And as I mentioned, I'm not like some, you know, there are people who only model. That's all they do. My mate Andy, he's a modeler. He loves it. That's all he does. And he doesn't even really model in ZBrush. And yet he doesn't really model these kind of environments either. He models characters, but he models them purely using polygons like this. And he's got to the point now where he's so good at it that he's partially designing new My Little Ponies for Hasbro by doing them, designing them directly in the modeling program. But he uses, you know, not many functions within. He uses 3D Studio Max, and don't think that that's like because it's necessarily superior to Maya. I mean, Maya has got loads of, how can I say, quirks, annoyances, but most of the time, actually, yeah, this is an important thing. Most of the time, don't complain too much about the software, right? If the software doesn't do something that you want it to do, however hard it is to accept this, it's probably you doing it wrong, right? Maya does crash more than it should, and there are certain functions like that tube mesh thing that are missing from it unless you download it, but for the most part it does what it needs to do, and it does what it needs to do pretty well. If something is going wrong, 99% of the time it is kind of your fault. You know, in the first part of the semester, people had, you know, the main thing where people had tons and tons of leftover floating vertices and faces and edges on top of other faces. That isn't Maya's fault, really. That kind of is your fault. I'm not trying to put you down with that, because for a lot of you, you'd never done any kind of CG modeling at all. But, you know, you can't expect to be, you know, a shit hot modeler instantly. You've got to practice at it like anything. But it takes less practice than you probably think. It takes smart practice rather than necessarily thousands of hours. There is the old Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours theory, which is, well, even the people who originally came up with it said that Malcolm Gladwell got it a bit wrong, but it's a combination, you know. Yeah, you do have to put in probably more time than you thought originally that you would have to put in. but at the same time, it's about practicing smart rather than practicing purely in sheer volume of hours. There's so much stuff available on YouTube. It's crazy. I sound like this is me trying to, by the way, tidy up the backside of this, which is a proper nightmare. At one point, I am going to cut the video because it was just getting too annoying, and I thought I'm not going to spend 20 minutes just trying to figure out how to properly close up this object and get the polygons flowing properly. So there will be a jump in the video, but that's all it is me going, right, a little bit like with that another support structure. I just at one point go no, and I trash most of it apart from the actual profile, and then figure out how the edge flow is going to work. But yeah, as I was saying, it's about how smart you practice, and you should be very, very grateful in some ways that there is a lot of invaluable material free online. Here I am sounding like an old, crusty old bastard here, but when I was learning this, YouTube didn't exist, and I remember my MA lecturer, I mean, just literally had no idea how to do it, and we were very frustrated because he was just reading out the tutorials with the instructions that came with the software, because the software used to come with these big thick telephone directory. I can't even say telephone directory because I doubt anyone uses that anymore. Bible-sized instruction manuals. I remember one of our lecturers just literally just walking us through the tutorial instruction manual, which felt a bit insulting because we were also, well, I say we were all, I was certainly, and some of my friends were all so hyped to learn this kind of thing that we'd taken the instruction manuals home over the weekend and read them as if they were the latest instalment by J.K. Rowling or something. But yeah, if you ran into a problem, that was it. You had the instruction manual and you had your friends, and that was about it. Now, if you run up against any kind of polygonal modeling problem, or any kind of Maya problem, or any kind of problem at all, you can jump on YouTube, and it's probably got the answer there. So I'm adding in some more detail here. I figure some more pipes would look nice. So I'm going to use Create Tube to create the initial pipe. And I'm going to reuse one of those little pipey vent things that I made earlier to kind of connect it up. Okay, I'm looking at the timeline. Probably in the last quarter now, home stretch. Yeah, so reusing detail. Reuse detail if you can. There is no shame in it. And the battery had run out on my little sound recorder. So I don't think I lost too much. So I'm back again here. Apologies if I repeat stuff that I've already said. Right, yeah. So I'm starting with a cylinder for this little canister bit. I like to start off, if I'm going to start off with a primitive shape, I actually prefer, I'll go to cylinders and pipes before I'll go to cubes or boxes. I would occasionally use a cube or box, but as I said, I like to work with a simple plane. But cylinders and pipes are really good. If you make them 8 sides, they're super easy to sort of terminate the caps on them in 4-sided faces, but you have to remember to make an 8-sided cylinder with 0 subdivisions on the cap, delete the cap, and kind of then make your own. Well, you don't have to delete the cap. If you delete the cap, if you're going to end up with a hole, but if you don't delete the cap, then you have to sort of use the multi-cut tool to just make a very simple sort of cross-shaped cut, one down the horizontal, one down the vertical, to kind of cap it, and it'll end up with 4 sides on the top. Right, yeah, so here I am just making this little sort of canister that's going to go on to the sort of diagonal part of the support column. I just figured it would look nice. You don't want everything to be straight edged and stuff like that. You want some smoother kind of shapes from a concept designy kind of point of view. Bear that in mind. You want some combinations and contrasts of curved, smooth shapes and more kind of straight, angular kind of shapes. And I thought it'd be a good excuse to have another little pipe in there as well. Okay, apologies if I mention this again as well, if I'm repeating myself. When you create a curve, a CV curve, that you're going to use potentially to make a tube, it doesn't matter where you draw that curve, the center point, the pivot point for it will always be, by default, at the origin, which can be not very useful. So what I like to do is I draw my curve out, and I don't care, you know, that the pivot point's at the origin. But as soon as I finish drawing my curve, I'll select the first point of the curve and just center pivot on it. Okay, so I'm making the floor here, and just very quickly there you see I created 2 edge loops to define the kind of the lip that goes around the edge that I can then extrude in. But then I created a diagonal edge and deleted those original edge loops that were horizontal and vertical. This both saves on geometry, there's less edges going on, and it also means that the flow of the edges goes round the corner. So I could add, if I wanted to now, I could add another edge loop in, and it would flow around the whole corner of it, which it would not do if I just left it with 2 edge loops, creating a kind of cross-like pattern at each corner. It's a very, very common thing, and a very important thing to kind of know. VFX people, I've mentioned this to some VFX people, when you get into year 2, in the past, Dan McCarthy has been a little bit frustrated that VFX students have gone through the entire first year and they still don't know what are normally considered to be fairly rudimentary skills when it comes to polygonal modeling. And one of those key skills is topology and edge flow, making stuff flow nicely around corners, turning an edge around a corner. Maybe he showed you it. I know that VFX people met with Dan last week for a tutorial session, so we might have shown it to a few people. Here we go. Here I am making this kind of square-like tube that runs down the length of the ceiling for the corridor. But I wanted to give it a little sort of bracket, a little brace here, and I'm using multiple edge loops here. The reason I've done this is I looked at the photo from Alien, and these square tubes were a little bit wonky. So I gave them some subdivision so I could wonkify them. This is a really important thing actually to bear in mind when you're modeling. To try not to make everything absolutely perfect. Now, I go on about people who have got too many edges, but they have too many edges right at the very, very beginning of their model. It's totally fine to model your object with the least amount of possible edges, but then if it needs a little bit of wear and tear, a little bit of de-perfecting, I don't know if you know that's a word, then you can add in some extra edge loops, and then you can kind of roughen up the overall feel of it. I'm not using any sculpting tools or anything fancy like that. Literally add in a few extra edge loops and then just sort of select them at random and move them off the axis a little bit, left and right, just so it gives that little square tube on the ceiling a slightly less than perfect feel. Maybe those of you who are already fairly proficient with modeling, maybe you don't know that. If you don't know that, then start considering that. You might have modelled 90% of your Mars base. It might be looking super nice, and I've seen some of your Mars bases that are almost modelled, and they do look very nice. Think about going in now, and now adding some subdivisions, and giving your object that less than totally perfect straight edge feel to it. It's amazing how subtle you can do it, and yet how profound an impact it can have on your model. So this are these kind of lights, flashing beacon light type things running down the length of the ceiling. Again, this time I started with a cylinder because it's essentially a cylinder shape, a bit like the bin actually. Okay, I think I'm at that point now. I'm going to duplicate it. I'm freezing everything, deleting the history of everything. Doing cleanup on the curves on those tubes, but I don't need to because I've already actually deleted history of them. Now I'm duplicating it. I'm going to flip it in a moment, and suddenly this one small little section of corridor, it's going to become a whole section. It already looks better when it's like that. I'm going to group. Well, before I group that, I'm going to shift the light over a little bit. Duplicate one more because I noticed in I'm going to combine and merge the floor, and I'm going to duplicate one more of those kind of square like tubes on the ceiling in a moment. Oh no, I'm going to duplicate it first. Again, I'm using holding down V, and I'm snapping it, duplicating it and snapping it to the edge because of the way I set up the pivot right at the beginning. And I'm using Shift D, which kind of duplicates but repeats the translation or the movement that you did last time, which is a pretty useful little function. Shift D. So if you duplicate something and move it, and then you do Shift D, it will duplicate it again with that movement. So you can quickly extend stuff like that, like you just saw. Well, now you've got what looks like a super complicated tunnel. So moving that across, I'm going to do a similar kind of thing. I'm going to make sure the pivot point's in the right place because it's not in the right place at the moment. So I'm just going to select those vertices, center pivot, duplicate, hold down V, translate it, and then Shift D, off it goes. Now it's almost it's too uniform at the moment. I mean, I think it looks kind of cool, but I look back at the original pictures from Alien, and I realised that those kind of consoles, those kind of panels, are not on every wall, and I think it looks better. Again, if everything's too symmetrical, kind of kills a little bit of life from it, if you ask me. So I'm going in now and I'm deleting some stuff. I realised that even on the left side wall, those panels, those console things, are not on every single segment of the tunnel. So I'm just going to semi-randomly go along and delete some while leaving others. Okay, I think it looks a little bit better. And then I figured I'm going to change also the aspect ratio to be a 2.35 to 1 aspect ratio. I'm going to switch on gate mask, and I'll probably play with the I don't know if I've already done it, but I also play with the focal length to make the camera a little bit wider. Okay, what I'm doing in here now I've built the structure of the tunnel, I want more pipes on the floor. So I'm exactly the same thing as the other pipes. I'm drawing CV curves and then using the bonus tools to create tube. Because again, it's another classic sci-fi designed trope to have pipes trailing along the floor as trip hazards. So actually I want this pipe to make some kind of sense, so I'm going to make it look like at least ends in that kind of little plug port type thing. And some of my CVs here begin overlapping and they start screwing up the actual geometry of the pipe. And at a certain point I realise where I've gone wrong, and I just haven't No amount of subdivision is going to help at the moment, Anthony. You're going to have to go in and figure out, yes, there we go. Yeah. Then you're going to have to reverse that. Good lad. There you go. So that's one. I figure I'm going to have some more pipes, more tubes. Maybe one running down the entire length, or almost the entire length of the corridor. More subdivisions to make it smooth. Now, if you were to take this into Substance, remember, you will need to modify Convert Smooth Mesh Preview to polygons. Otherwise, Substance will do all the texturing on the lower resolution. And you'll end up with very, very faceted looking textures. Although Arnold, the actual renderer in Maya, will render the smooth mesh preview as smooth. So it's a bit annoying. Some things are compatible across the board amongst renderer, Maya and Substance, and other things aren't. Here I am toying with the idea of having a pipe dangling from the ceiling along the length, but as you'll see, I abandon this. There's already too much kind of pipey detail going on in the ceiling. It doesn't need more. The floor can kind of put up with some pipes because the floor is mostly flat, so it's not distracting. So I'm trying to bring to mind this idea of not overloading the eye with detail. So yeah, I waste about 5 minutes with this pipe and then go, no, delete, rubbish. And we're almost at the end. I save, and now I figure, I'm just going to have a quick little play around with the lights. Just a quick. Oh yeah, here I go. Yeah, I'm fiddling around with the focal length now, making it a bit wider. I think, yes, that's got that classic alien feel to it. Create a shot cam. So when I position the view that I like, go to View, Create Camera from View, rename that new camera as Shot Cam, do a bookmark on it so that I can reposition and twiddle around and always go back to where I was before, and then duplicate a couple of these lights just to create that kind of that look. And yeah, we're almost there. I think in a moment, yeah, I did a little camera animation. Okay, so that took me about 4 hours to do that. I think you could do it way quicker. I'm sure some of you are already getting to be demon modelers, right? And so you should do it much quicker. Anyway, I'll see you tomorrow. Goodbye.